Resuming debate, the honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Okay, gotcha.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's truly a pleasure for me to rise and to consume about 30 minutes of this House's time on this issue. I'll couch my opening remarks by saying it was a privilege for me at one point in time in my life to earn a Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences Zoology degree from the University of Alberta. I worked as a fisheries technician and on many fisheries experiments. I worked as a National Park Warden in Parks Canada, enforcing the Fisheries Act, among other things, and of course as a conservation officer in the province of Alberta, doing much the same. So I have a little bit of working knowledge on this. Proud to have folks like Dr. David Schindler as part of my professor, the professors that I learned, I would like to say I learned something from, although if I told you when I was going to school, Mr. Speaker, that would date probably both of us, and I don't think that's a particularly constructive thing to do at this particular point in time. However, suffice to say, I remain active. I was a fishing guide in the Northwest Territories while I was going to university. I spent a lot of time on Great Bear Lake and, of course, on the North Coast, where the Coppermine River, in particular, flows into the Arctic Ocean, and have maintained my love of the outdoors as an avid hunter and angler ever since. So these kinds of issues are near and dear to my heart, especially when it comes to recreational fishing, or as it's more affectionately known as sport fishing. But Mr. Speaker, these issues are very, very important, and I'll start by making some comparisons. When I was going to the University of Alberta years and years ago, there was a plan at that time by the World Wildlife Fund and various the Canadian Wilderness Societies and so on, that they wanted a 12, 75, and 12 plan. And what that 12, 75, and 12 plan was, they wanted to have 12% of all of the land mass in Canada protected under the same kind of statutory protection that a national park would have. So that meant no opportunities to do anything, no development, and so on, so that there would be a complete, protection for that area. I don't want to call it conservation, I call it a preservation type of protection that they would have in these areas. The other 75% of Canada would be considered areas that would be managed. So these would be managed areas like forest management areas. These would be areas where you would have human activity would go on, but there would be zoning, there would be activities that would be permitted, but it would be heavily regulated by either federal, provincial, or municipal governments. And then about another 12% of our land mass at that particular point in time was said this is going to be a complete disturbance area, so this would be areas for our cities, for our roads, major industrial developments, and so on. And I remember asking the question when I was in university, is 12, 75, 12 going to be enough? And roughly that adds up to 99, but you get the point, Mr. Speaker. And as we've seen it evolve through time, those numbers no longer hold true today with what certain groups are asking for. They're asking for more of that preservation land. They're asking for stricter regulations on the 75%. And of course, nobody wants to take responsibility for the 12% because that would mean that we'd have to tear down cities and do all those kinds of things in order to restore it back to its natural habitat. And of course, that's not a reasonable thing to ask people to do. So who bears the burden then every time somebody asks for more protection? We got to take that protection out of that 12% or out of that 75% to add to the 12%. And I'm talking about the preserved area. So who suffers the consequence of that? Well, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm using this as an example on land to make my point later on about the protected areas in the marine areas. Who bears that price? It's everybody that lives in rural Canada. It's everybody who farms, everybody who relies on forestry, it's everybody who's a fisherman or a fisher person or fisher people kind, depending on what the moniker of the day is. But Mr. Speaker, I make my point. That point is that everything that we ask to happen in the natural environment generally happens outside the confines of city limits. And this is not an aspersion on folks that live in cities. I live in a city myself, but I understand growing up on a farm that every time somebody has to pay a price out in our so-called natural areas, that price is borne by the people who live there and make their livings in these rural, remote, or I'll call them non-city areas. Well, the same is going to actually hold true for those who earn a living in our marine areas. So this would be our commercial fishermen. This would be anybody who does any tourism, anybody who does any type of business, and of course First Nations people who earn a living off the coastal waters of our country. And we've seen the absolute damage that can be done, the economic damage that can be done to these communities when we don't get things right. So as we know, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is tasked with maintaining fish stocks. We know in Atlantic Canada, going back to the early 1990s, some of the issues that happened there when we applied a purely political decision over good science and technical information. And I'm referring specifically to the collapse of the cod fishery. Now, I was a fairly young man at the time, but I was studying in university in the late 80s and early 90s at about the same time that cod fishery was closed. I believe it was in early 1990s. I think 1993 rings a bell when that cod fishery was closed. And it was closed because it was mismanaged. At that time, there was a little over 1 million seals in the Atlantic Ocean. Today we have 6 or 7 million seals there. It was a big problem, and the fishermen of the time had to move to other resources. So they had to move to the herring, they had to move to lobsters, they had to move to other fisheries. They had to adapt in order to overcome the loss of the cod. And to this day, we've had a moratorium. And I just want to tell everybody what a moratorium actually means. A moratorium on cod fishing for the commercial fishery means that nobody's allowed to do it. So the cod, for all intents and purposes, are preserved. The cod population stocks are under a preservation style of protection. Have the cod stocks actually come back? No, they have not. So we've moved this from a managed fishery into a completely protected class. And even that movement in and of itself hasn't actually had the desired effect or outcome that we've wanted. We haven't stopped any of the other activity that happens off of the East Coast. There's still ships coming in and out. I would argue we have lots of ships of foreign oil coming into the East Coast. It would be much nicer to have a pipeline going from Alberta to our friends out east, but I digress. It's a much easier thing to manage than ships full of, or tankers full of oil coming in on the East Coast. By the way, wouldn't it be interesting to see if we had a tanker ban on the East Coast the same way that we do on the West Coast? Seems to be a bit of a double standard there, but I'm getting a little bit off topic, and I'm going to try and come back to marine protected areas, Mr. Speaker. But my point being this: when we took a look at the management and we moved from a management mode of the cod stocks into a preservation mode, it didn't solve the problem. I'm not saying it wasn't the right decision, but it didn't solve the problem because all of the other aspects of managing the cod fishery have now fallen by the wayside. Department of Fisheries and Oceans is now tasked rather than restoring the cod stocks or managing the cod stocks. And I'm not saying that they're not doing some of that work, but now they're more interested in actually working on the fisheries that are currently before them. Now, you have to add on top of that the fact that now the government has proposed, the Liberal government over here has proposed, moving to a massive increase of the marine protected areas in our coastal waters. And I was lucky. I was a member of the Fisheries Committee in the previous parliaments for a long time because of my experience. As a matter of fact, people used to laugh when they found out a farm boy from Central Alberta was a member of the Standing Committee of Fisheries and Oceans for all those years until they actually found out that I actually knew a little bit about fisheries. Other than how bad of a fisherman I actually am. But notwithstanding any of that, I learned a ton over the years on this, and I was very honored to go with the actual standing committee on one of their trips up north. We went to places like Prince Rupert, we went to Inuvik, we went to Tuktoyaktuk, we went to Palatuk, and we talked with the people who are going to be impacted by these marine protected areas there. And Mr. Speaker, the impacts and the concerns are very, very real. When you have people from the local hunting and trapping associations up north coming in droves to these meetings and making their voices heard, they're very, very concerned because some of the areas that are being proposed, they feel there hasn't been adequate consultation on, and there's very good risks or very, very good questions about the risks of what's going to happen in a marine protected area. And this is where we get to the conversation about what the international standard for a marine protected area is and how Canada is going to define a marine protected area. If you ask somebody at the United Nations, they're going to consider the marine protected area to be a place, no activity zone whatsoever. This is complete protection, or what I would refer to earlier as that preservation mentality. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's the mode that most people would see when you hear about a marine protected area having the same types of protections that a national park would. Everybody knows you can't hunt in a national park. You don't drill for anything in a national park. As a matter of fact, if you had, I've been an MP for 12 years, so Mr. Speaker. Resort owners and so on inside our national parks haven't really seen any changes over the last 12 years because it's so hard. It's so hard to actually get approval to get anything done in a national park. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just very, very difficult in order to do that because of the mandate that Parks Canada has on its preservation, on its ecological integrity, and all of the other types of goals and ambitions that are laid out in the Parks Canada Act. Those same goals and ambitions are laid out in the legislative changes that are currently before this House with C-55 and, of course, Bill C-68, which the government opposite just actually moved time allocation on, a bill that might actually be disastrous for the Alberta economy, just another straw on an already broken camel's back when it comes to the energy sector. But I'm digressing again. I'm going to get back to C-55. So my point being, with C55, with the Aboriginal groups, the Inuit folks that we talked to up north. We talked to the people at the Prince Rupert Port Authority. You talked to the First Nations groups out there, Lax Kw'alaams and all the other groups that are out there. They're very, very concerned. PNCEMA was brought up. Very, very concerned about the amount of foreign money that's coming in to influence policy decisions. This money is coming in. It's been used by some Aboriginal groups or Indigenous groups out there to stop, to inadvertently stop what they thought was just going to be an increase in the conversation. They realized that they've sided with a bunch of people and took money from a bunch of organizations that actually have a completely different mandate than what the First Nations have. As a matter of fact, there's actually court action happening right now where First Nations groups in BC are raising funds to take the government the Government of Canada to court, citing all of the barriers that they put in place in the names of standing up for First Nations, where they're going to deprive them of economic opportunities going forward. And this is something that is a very legitimate concern with Bill C-55, which is the marine protected areas. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a tanker ban off the west coast, the northern part of the west coast, which most people don't think that all of the west coast of BC or the entire west side of BC is coastal. It's not. Only about just a little over a third of the west side of the province of British Columbia actually has access to the coast. The rest of it's Alaska. And we'd have to go through Alaska in order to get some things done if we wanted to use the coastline in that particular case. But we've got a very small area to use along the British Columbia coast to begin with, and now we've got a significant part of that coast is actually denied access depending on what you're actually trying to ship or move. Now imagine, Mr. Speaker, I might be a little bit cynical, but this is what the folks on the west coast are thinking, and this is what the folks on the north coast are thinking that we met on the committee. The folks up north, they want to be able to continue to hunt whales. Well, one of the marine protected areas that they're considering putting in place is actually right in the mouth of the Mackenzie River, in the delta where it comes in, and that happens to be a beluga area where the belugas come into shallow water. It's a safe place for the Inuit hunters to go, and they often go there every year to hunt belugas. If you put the marine protected area in that same area and propose it to protect the belugas, which seems to be a noble cause, but it actually exempts the Inuit from actually harvesting in that area, then they're going to have to try and find those belugas someplace else in order to maintain their traditional hunt. Well, that's a problem for the First Nations people there. So are we going to create marine protected areas in Canada that don't actually meet the international standard of what's expected of us as a marine protected area? Or are we going to do a made in Canada solution and forego our international obligations and then do our best? I'm not sure what the government's intentions are on that. It would be great to see, but we seem to have a lot more questions than we do answers, and the legislation is not particularly clear on some of these questions. But, Mr. Speaker, I'll go back to the port in Prince Rupert. If you met with the port authorities there, they're already very much concerned, and most people don't know this in Canada, but most of the container goods that we see going through the western part of Canada on their way east, a ton of the containers that come in on the west coast come in through Rupert. They've got a great container facility there, and they're railed all the way through Canada, all the way down into Chicago. And this is supplying goods from the Asia-Pacific marketplace into central North America as a distribution hub. It's absolutely an amazing facility. It's a very small community. It's a great provider of jobs, great economic opportunities that are there. They had a proposal for an LNG terminal right there at Prince Rupert. Well, we know what's happened with the LNG proposal. That seems to have gone by the wayside. Given the fact that you're going to have a tanker ban, there's no way that anybody would even consider moving forward with an LNG terminal in that particular area. Now, if I was the kind of person that wanted to be bitter and vindictive about making sure that the tanker ban always held its way for all time, I would consider putting a marine protected area across the Dixon entrance and across the Hecate Strait. This pretty much means, Mr. Speaker, that particular area, if it was, depending on the provisions that were put in place for the marine protected area, could shut down shipping altogether in those areas, or at least really restrict what you're able to do. And this, again, brings me back to my point. What is a marine protected area actually supposed to do? Is it supposed to protect the water? Is it supposed to protect the species living in the water? Is it supposed to protect the benthic area directly below the water column along the seafloor? These are all questions to which we don't have answers. If you take a look at the sunlit zone, which is the area that the human eye can see sunlight in the top of a water column, there's not a whole lot of activity there. There's some fish species that happen there, there's some algae, there's some plankton, But all of this stuff is very much moving as currents move in and out. Does it make any sense to try and protect a wave while it's a wave? It doesn't make any sense at all. These things are going to move around the ocean. So are we actually protecting that area? Some would say yes, some would say no. Are we protecting a rearing area for whales or other types of migratory species that use the water? Is it going to be birds? Is it going to be fish? Is it going to be aquatic mammals? Is it going to be terrestrial animals that rely a certain part of their life cycle on the marine environment? Are we adequately taking into consideration where those protections should be best placed? Are we taking a look at the littoral zone? Are we going to protect the littoral zone? Are we going to protect the benthic zone? So are we going to shut down fishing, commercial fishing, for example? Are we going to be shutting down, dragging or trawling along the bottom, seafloor trawling for fish species? Maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not. I happen to believe that in certain cases, if it's done in the right place, protections on the bottom of the seafloor are great. They're great for groundfish that would live there, especially if it's an area that's rich in groundfish that usually stay in that same area. An area of refugia actually creates species all around it. One of my jobs as a park warden, and I'll go back to it, Mr. Speaker, was to patrol the north boundary of Jasper National Park on horseback. Why I ever gave that job up in the glorious Rocky Mountains riding horses, I still to this day don't understand. But my job was to protect that park boundary from poachers. But where did everybody go hunting for trophy rams or large bighorn sheep? Well, they would go hunting where the rams are. And where were the rams? They were in the national park because they understood the refugia. And they would go back into the park anytime that they felt threatened. They actually knew where the boundary was. It was an interesting thing to watch. But that area of refugia continues to populate the sheep populations as they migrate out. Same thing with other species. This is not necessarily bad policy, but it's not an effective one-size-fits-all policy for everything. It's going to work well for some species of groundfish, but it's not going to do anything for some species of fish that might migrate through or don't use the area on a regular basis at all. And we have to ask the question, is the marine protected area in the right spot? Mr. Speaker, could you let me know when I have about 1 minute left? Okay, so I have a lot of questions actually about this legislation and what the consequences of that legislation might actually be. I've highlighted the fact that the cod fishery taking the protectionist approach hasn't exactly worked if we're not taking a serious look at management. And when we put things into that category of preservation, it becomes very, very, very difficult to do any management because you have to get double approvals for everything. Imagine if Parks Canada said, we need to shoot grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions in order to protect caribou. It's actually not unfathomable that might actually be a desperation policy at some particular point down the road as the wolf population, the grizzly bear population, and mountain lion populations continue to grow and explode in the eastern slopes region of Alberta. These animals are everywhere, so much so that in some areas you can't find any ungulates left anymore. And rather than stopping economic activities such as oil and gas exploration or forestry, we're going to shut those industry downs and not do anything at all about predator control. I don't see some of my colleagues that were here earlier from Atlantic Canada, but I know that a lot of them here, even though they might not say it in front of a microphone, I know they hear the same things that I hear because I've been there many times with fisheries, and they're asking for a control of the seal population in order to allow the cod stocks to come back. But imagine creating a situation where you create a marine protected area now around some of the islands where gray seals or harbor seals now do rear their pups. And it comes down to the point that someday, somewhere, somebody says we have to have the courage to actually manage these populations and do what's right. Imagine trying to manage that population or manage predator control now in a protected area where the needs of the wildlife come before the needs of everybody else or a fishery or whatever the case might be. Because I got news for you, it's romantic to think about the fact that we actually have the ability to have these protected areas and they can operate in isolation from the rest of the world, but that's not the case, Mr. Speaker. This bill could seriously limit the ability of Fisheries and Oceans and other organizations to effectively manage wildlife populations and allow other economic activities to go. And this bill shouldn't be rushed through Parliament. It should be given every opportunity. And that's why I move, second by the member for Bow River that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following for Bill C-55, an act to amend the Oceans Act and the Canada Petroleum Resources Act, be not now read a third time, but be referred back to the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans for the purpose of reconsidering all of the clauses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Calkins, seconded by Mr. Shields, moves that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following, therefore. Bill C-55, an act to amend the Oceans Act and the Canada Petroleum Resources Act, be not now read a third time, but be referred back to the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans for the purpose of reconsidering all of the clauses. And I see the Honourable Government House Leader rising on a point.
Mr. Speaker, an agreement could not be reached under the provisions of Standing Order 78.1 or 78.2 with respect to the second reading stage of Bill C-71, an act to amend certain acts and regulations in relation to firearms. Under the provisions of Standing Order 78.3, I give notice that a Minister of the Crown will propose at the next sitting a motion to allot a specific number of days or hours for the consideration and disposal of proceedings at the said stage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The House appreciates the notice, part of the Honourable Government House Leader. We're now going to questions and comments. Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I can appreciate the background knowledge the member has and brings to the table when he addresses the legislation that we have before us. But, you know, I get this sense in listening to a number of his Conservative colleagues and to a certain degree himself that the Conservative Party doesn't recognize the benefit to society in terms of how and why it's so important that we have legislation of this nature brought in. And what I'm interested in knowing from the member's personal point of view, does he not believe that government does have a role, a strong role to play to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that, and again, I'm looking for his personal opinion on this based on his background, does he not believe that there is a role for the government to play in terms of whether it's protecting our coastlines or protecting endangered species? Obviously, Canadians want to see that happen. Conservatives appear not to, or in a different, bizarre way, but I'm interested in the member's personal opinion on it, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to his question, I think Canadians are rightly concerned at the pace at which the current government is ramming legislation through this House. I think this is, what, the fourth time allocation that we've heard of today. Now we know that they're going to run through the gun registry bill without even 1 hour debate before the House. We've got notice that we're going to have time allocation on that. But notwithstanding that, I mean, the honourable member's been here for a while, longer than I would like, I'll admit. But if he was here during the last Parliament, the Parliaments before, where we created marine protected areas on the Great Lakes, we created marine protected areas in other parts of the country, and we did it in a methodological approach that actually resulted in buy-in from everyone. As we've seen, this government this is the most ideological government I've ever seen. This government, just ask Chantal Hébert, go read the articles that Chantal Hébert, a well-known Conservative, has written about the ideology of this government. And so they ram through the tanker ban. They're going to get sued on that by First Nations groups on the West Coast. They ram this through, they're going to get sued on it too.
Questions and comments. Essay commentaire. The Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his speech. He brought up some issues around the concept of, no-take zones, of really protecting these areas. These are called marine protected areas, so you would think they'd be protected from something. And he said, maybe in some some situations it might be worthwhile to, for instance, ban bottom trawling. You know, one of the most destructive methods of harvesting animals from the ocean floor. I'm just wondering, shouldn't in a marine protected area that be kind of the obvious first choice, that if you wanted exceptions you'd have to talk about that later? But I'm just wondering, under what conditions would he think that bottom trawling would be good in a marine protected area?
Well, member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member was paying attention, I talked about the fact that, yes, it's a good idea to protect some areas in a protected area. I talked about the 1275-12 that was a policy that was lobbied for a long time ago. The context of my speech was making sure that we got the right protected areas protected, making sure that we've got halibut spawning areas protected, making sure that we've got certain species of groundfish protected, because most of these fisheries that are on the bottom are not generally, and I'm talking generalizations right now, not migratory species. These are species that stick around in the same general protected areas, and I don't have a problem at all with protecting some of those areas. I just have great concerns at the pace at which the current government's going about doing this, not taking the scientific or technical. There's parts of our ocean that we haven't even mapped yet, Mr. Speaker, and we're going ahead creating marine protected areas without fully understanding if we're putting them in the right place. And my fear, Mr. Speaker, is given this government's agenda to shut down the energy sector, that the marine protected areas are going to be put in places to stop shipping lanes and to prevent a future government someday opening up. And I know this to be true, Mr. Speaker, because in the legislation, they're actually canceling, and for the cancellation of any energy projects, they're going to compensate those interests based on the Canadian Petroleum Resources Act. If that's not an admission that they're going to shut down the energy sector, I don't know what is.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Bow River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciated my colleague's well thought out and his educational background and his actual practice. One of the things that on the Environment Committee that we heard from, and I know he's been to that area, was people from the north, Inuit, and what they said to us, what you're proposing here to us is another form of colonization. They were opposed to this. They want to have the right to develop their own resources, fishing, and on the land. They were very opposed to this, and they believe this is another form of colonization, not reconciliation at all, but much worse. So on your trip to the north, I wonder if you heard similar things being expressed.
Well, member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Well, I'm not sure if he's referring to your trip to the north or not, Mr. Speaker, but if he's referring to my trip to the north, this is exactly what we heard. I was there with my colleagues, some of the colleagues on the from our side of the House on the Fisheries Committee, and we heard exactly those concerns. I mean, the people that live in the north, particularly in the Arctic, high Arctic, live right along the coast. They live right along the coast for a very good reason. That's where almost all of their food comes from. It's where all of their activity and where they get all of their provisions for the upcoming winter season from. So they need to be access to seals. They got to have access to the pack ice in the wintertime. They got to have access to beluga whales and the char fisheries and salmon fisheries and so on that are up there. So what we heard very clearly while we were up there in Palatec, while we were in Tuktoyaktuk, while we were in Inuvik, we talked to the hunting and trapping associations, we talked to the chiefs, we talked to the elders, we talked to all the stakeholders that were there, because virtually all of them in each of those communities had a very vested interest in being able to continue on with their traditional way of life. The previous NDP MP that asked me a question said, don't we want to protect these areas 100%? Well, good luck if you're going to slap a marine protected area right in the middle of some place where the Inuit are harvesting their beluga whales as a matter of tradition, because that's just a lawsuit waiting to happen, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, New Democrats have concerns about this legislation, certainly around the failure to set minimum protection standards and targets for zoning for marine protected areas. And we know that we have concerns about oil and gas being conducted in these marine protected areas. In fact, that's supported by the World Wildlife Federation of Canada. Quote, this is a quote from them. The government is planning to create a marine protected area around the Laurentian Channel where the North Atlantic right whales are known to frequent, but proposed regulations will still allow oil and gas drilling and seismic blasts in 80% of the MPA. These activities threaten whales and other wildlife. An oil spill would be even more devastating. So my question to the member, does he agree with the Liberals that oil and gas exploration should be permissible in a marine protected area, and that we should be gutting environmental regulations in favor of industrial development?
Member for Red Deer Lacombe.
I don't see how a single New Democrat could stand up in this House and accuse the current government of putting forward legislative changes that are in any way, shape, or form benefiting the oil and gas sector. I've been here and watching this economic disaster in progress for the better part of the last 2.5 years, and I simply don't know where the honourable member is sourcing his questions from. What I do know is that the price of gasoline in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia right now is about 30 to 40 cents a litre higher than it is everywhere else. Sure would be a real shame to shut off that pipeline from Alberta and watch it go to $2.50 a litre.
We have time for one more question and response. Honourable Member for Guelph.
Mr. Speaker, and I'm listening to the discussion today, thinking that there's a classic situation unfolding again where the NDP thinks that the government is not doing enough, and is doing too much, and the Conservatives are saying that we're not doing enough. But back to the discussion around protection of the oceans, and whether the honourable member would agree that protecting the wildlife that are in the oceans will protect the upstream wildlife as well, and that the entire ecosystem where he used to fish in the Northwest Territories would actually benefit from protecting the oceans that those rivers feed into.
The Honourable Member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Well, listen, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the fact that my colleague has actually asked me a forthright question out of concern. Look, I don't disagree with the premise of his question at all. The issue that I have with the rapid pace at which this legislation is going to be put in place, the massive amount of power now that the Governor and Council is going to have to make the regulations. My NDP colleague who asked me the question earlier was right in the fact that the legislation doesn't clearly define some of the things that it should be clearly defining. So I'll give my colleague that from the NDP. But the problem that we actually have is that the rapid pace at which we're going ahead with this legislation, the agenda of having almost 10% of our marine protected areas protected by 2020, without even actually having the basic understanding and the science that we need to have to make sure that we actually protect the right areas, is going to lead to political decisions, and those political decisions will not be in the best interests of Canada, and that's my concern, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming